Hello, Bedford. My name is Mike Fournier, and I'm the Superintendent of Schools for the Bedford School District. And I'm here today with my friend Emma Dolan, and we are going to be having a conversation about something that's very important to our youth and our teens in our community, and that is about dating and sexual violence. But before we jump into that, I'd like Emma to take a minute and introduce herself and her background.
Yes. Hi, my name's Emma. I'm the Community Education Coordinator at YWCA New Hampshire. So if you don't know what YWCA New Hampshire is, we are located 72 Concord Street in Manchester. We are a nonprofit organization. So our mission is eliminating racism and empowering women. So we have a whole bunch of different services that we offer. I work upstairs in our REACH Crisis Center. So REACH Crisis, it's the member program. Our parent is basically New Hampshire Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. So part of my role is to go out into the community, talk about healthy relationships, talk about consent, boundaries, domestic and sexual violence, and get people connected to services if that's something that they're interested in. So really we just serve people who are experiencing domestic sexual violence, stalking, and trafficking. So that's kind of my role.
Well, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So for the community to know, every other year, usually the odd years, the Bedford School District participates in what's called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. And that survey is provided to all the students at Bedford High School, and it's done in our state, it's done regionally, all over the country. It's hosted by the Centers for Disease Control. And then our local agency, DHHS, in New Hampshire helps with those results. So we recently did the 2023 survey in January. Those results are not in, of course. However, we do have the 2021 results. And I know that feels like a long time ago, but the results tell a story over time. And there's some patterns that we see about different behaviors. The report is quite long. However, today we're really specifically targeting dating and sexual violence. That is a problem not only in Bedford for our kids, but in our region and our state and across the country. Mm-hmm. And so that's why people like Emma, who are with us today, they are really trying to work with communities on these problems for us to help solve them, for our kids to be informed and for parents to know what's going on. So I guess the first thing that I want to say is all of the information regarding the Youth Risk Behavior Survey is on our website. So www.sau25.net, go under information and reports. You can see YRBS. There are 3 reports on there. There's the 2019 results, and then there's the 2021 preliminary and the 2021 final results. So today is the 23rd of March. Yesterday, the 22nd of March, I received the final results from 2021. So sometimes it takes a long time to get these results in, but again, we're looking for patterns. Mm-hmm. So with that said, Emma, when you reviewed our results, was there any one question or any series of questions that kind of stood out to you that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, definitely. There were a few that definitely stuck out to me. So it does cover a range of topics, but the sexual violence ones that I kind of honed in on were the amount of students over the past year that had been made to have unwanted sexual intercourse. The preliminary results showed that 101 students had reported that. Now, again, with surveys, the numbers can be a little bit skewed, right? Are the numbers looking high because people are comfortable coming forward? Or is it that it's happening more often, right? It's kind of hard to tell with these, but the numbers show that 101 students were open and comfortable saying they were made to have unwanted sexual intercourse.
And to be clear, mm-hmm. that's rape. Mm-hmm. Right? So we have 101 students who reported that they were raped.
Yep.
And would you say nationally people would argue that these numbers are generally underreported mm-hmm. because people feel ashamed,
exactly.
They feel guilty, they feel like people won't understand.
Yep.
And so sometimes we wonder, well, are the kids telling the truth? Mm-hmm. And the argument sometimes is, are these numbers inflated? Mm-hmm. I think statistically speaking, we'd say these numbers are underreported.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in my mind, I read that at least 101 students have experienced unwanted sexual intercourse, right? That number could be doubled, right? And it's just students that aren't comfortable coming forward for a number of reasons, that they're not comfortable with reporting, right? Fear that they're going to get in trouble, that they're going to disappoint somebody, that they're going to be shamed, blamed, guilted in some way, shape, or form. So these numbers it's kind of generalized, but it can be fairly assumed that the actual numbers are higher, for sure.
Okay, and then just so people have context, there were almost 1,500 responses to this question. So there was 1,454 responses. Of those responses, 101 said yes. So the other piece that's interesting is on the preliminary results, Bedford's numbers were, the percentage of students was higher compared to region and the state, but on the final report, it sort of came in line better. It doesn't excuse or pardon the problem. We still need to address it, but it's certainly a problem.
Yeah.
Was there another one that stood out to you?
Yes. So an even higher number, 176 students faced some sort of sexual violence within the past 12 months. So that is not just including rape, that would include sexual harassment, some sort of unwanted sexual contact, right? Some sort of sexual violence that they had experienced just within a year, right? So that was an even higher number than just unwanted sexual intercourse. This involves much more sexual violence activities.
Right, so the question, just so that families in the community know, the question that for the students answered there was, during the last 12 months, how many times did anyone force you to do sexual things that you did not want to do? That includes things like kissing, touching, being physically forced to have sexual intercourse. And so in your role, I mean, you don't serve just Bedford, you serve a region, right? So how surprising were Bedford numbers to you compared to like some of your other roles?
It's hard to say. I mean, any number more than one is always, it should make you feel uncomfortable, right? Any sort of number that you're seeing as a response to yes to any of these questions should give you a gut reaction of that's way too much, right? So it does. 176, that's a big number, right? That's a lot of students that are experiencing this, but I do want to make note that it's not just Bedford. This is happening everywhere. We serve Manchester, Goffstown, Londonderry. We serve other towns other than Bedford, and it's happening there too. It's not just isolated to the high school, right? It happens everywhere, but it does give you a gut reaction of like, oh, that's way too much.
It is way too much. And I want to say something else. I think oftentimes when we think about things like sexual violence and rape, we think about girls. But these results tell us that this is happening to boys as well. And there was one question in particular that talked about, has an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever made you do sexual things that you did not want to do? And again, kissing, touching, being made to have sexual intercourse. And that number, the preliminary reports were, 96 kids, so just under 100. And then so just over 6%. Of course, we were lower than the region, lower than the state. But I think it's important for the community to know that this is it's not just a girl problem. This is a boy problem too, and it's an everyone problem.
And I always say domestic and sexual violence does not discriminate. It can happen to anybody of any age, race, religion, ethnic background. No matter how somebody identifies, sexual violence and domestic violence does not discriminate. It can happen to anybody at any point. But that was one that I had kind of wrote that also gave me a gut feeling that was like, ugh, because how old are the students that are answering these questions, right? Could it be a 15-year-old that is now reporting that they were made to do unwanted sexual things with somebody at least 20 years old? So again, it's beyond just school. It's a community problem.
Right. So now this is an interesting, so out of a lot of these questions, we take a look at what is a higher percentage for Bedford versus where is Bedford sort of doing better, so to speak. So I'm going to talk about one that Bedford is not doing better, and that is, during the last 12 months, how many times have you experienced an unwanted sexual advance because of another student's drinking, right? Now, one could argue that Bedford kids, I'm a Bedford resident, I live here, maybe our kids have more access to alcohol. I don't know the answer to that question. However, 86 out of our 1,400 said yes, in the last 12 months, I had an unwanted sexual advance because of alcohol. Do you see that often in your work with kids, that alcohol is sort of a contributing factor to these things?
It's definitely a contributing factor, but I always like to make note that violence, specifically domestic and sexual violence, does not happen because of alcohol. Right? It might be a contributing factor into controlling behaviors, and maybe somebody gets more aggressive when they're drinking. But violence in and of itself, it does not happen because of alcohol.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
So, some of the things, I'm sure parents and community members are hearing this and they're sort of maybe shocked and it's sort of making this real. So, we've talked about this as a school community a bit, and, we've talked about this is not a school problem.
Correct.
This is a community problem. The school can bring resources to bear.
Yep.
You, of course, are helpful. But really, where the rubber hits the road is kind of at home with mom and dad,
Yep.
right? So by the time this show airs, we're heading towards prom season. And, prom season for some kids is a milestone, right? And a milestone where they make decisions about things that they will or will not do. And that could include sexual intercourse, right? And so this is almost perfect timing for parents to at least open the door to have conversations. So one of the things I want to ask you is, families are probably like, how do I address this, and what's the right age?
Right, and it's awkward and guaranteed, especially, and I go to classrooms to talk about consent and everything, and I always tell my students, you're likely never going to sit down with your partner or whoever it is and say, let's talk about consent, right?
Right.
Or it's not always going to look like that, and it's likely not going to look like that even as parents when you're talking to your children, right? Or whoever the adult is in the home. It might be in response to something that you saw on the news. It might be in response to maybe this video, right? Hey, I saw Mr. Fournier put out this video. What's this about? Like, what do you know about sexual violence, right? What are you comfortable with? Have you had these experiences yet, right? What can I do to support you? Really the best thing that you can do as a parent, as a community member, is to be having these conversations. And it's awkward, right? You don't want to be thinking about your child or your student doing any of these things, right? But especially the numbers from the survey show, it's happening, right? It's happening. They're engaging in these activities. So how can we help students stay safe? How can we help students know of their resources should they find themselves in not a great situation, maybe on prom night, for example? Really having those conversations at the dinner table, in the car, after watching something on the news, right? It doesn't always have to be this serious sit-down conversation of we need to talk about this, right? It's just kind of planting the seed into a larger conversation.
Do you think that sort of for some families who may not be able to directly talk about this subject, the concept of when you go to a party or you're at a friend's house or you're at the prom or at an after party, make sure you're in a situation with a group, or make sure you're in a situation where you can call me anytime, or I'm a phone call away, or you're with somebody, almost like an opportunity not to be in an unsafe place. And I hesitate to say that because when you're with somebody and you're sort of romantically involved, of course you're going to feel safe generally. But I wonder if those conversations can be helpful as well.
Yeah, and even when it comes to partying, drinking alcohol, right? Okay, if your parent isn't the right person for you to call because, again, you're worried about getting in trouble and what the consequences are. Okay, as a student, can you call Auntie Sue? Can you call older sibling, right? Who is the person you can call to get yourself out of that situation? But I do always want to bring it back to preventative measures, right? It should never even get to that point where the survivor or the victim, the responsibility is on them to get out of the situation. It should always be, no, the perpetrator, why is this behavior happening? Right? We don't condone that.
And how do we prevent it?
And honestly, the best way to prevent that is to have these conversations at home, have these conversations in the classroom, start talking about consent and boundaries, and really just kind of opening the door to this behavior is not okay, right? And not to shame you if this is something that you're experiencing for lack of knowledge, right? You don't know how to set boundaries. You don't know what consent is, right? Okay, now that opens the door to, all right, let's educate you and let's have these conversations more about why this is unacceptable, why this is a dangerous behavior to be engaging in.
Well, and I also think for families to know that it's never too early. So when you think about toddlers and kindergartners and first graders, at least in the school, we're having ongoing conversations with kids who are putting their hands on each other.
Yep.
Right? And what's appropriate and what's not appropriate.
Yep.
And the same thing at the intermediate school
Yep.
and the middle school and of course into high school. And as the kids get older in our health and wellness classes, we start talking more explicitly about boundaries,
Yep.
about emotional manipulation, about consent. And we're not always just talking about sex.
Right.
We're just talking about being able to have a healthy
Yes.
relationship with another person where you are equals in that relationship.
Yep. And that's always the basis that I set all of my conversations about healthy relationships on, right? Especially when I go into a high school, it's not just romantic partners. Okay, tell me about the relationships that you have with your friends, family, coworkers, teammates, classmates. It's a whole range of interpersonal relations that don't have to do with just consent in terms of sex.
Right.
It's a much larger conversation.
So one of the things that we run into that we hear in the schools is not always do kids want to talk to their parents about this stuff. Like some kids, I've raised 3 kids,
Yep.
well, still raising them, but raised 3 kids and, one of them tells us everything.
Yep.
Another one's a little bit more private, right? And so, it's not one of those things where you're like, okay, it's Tuesday at 4:00,
Yeah.
we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about consent. It usually happens in a really organic
Yeah.
kind of way, right?
Yep.
But if you have one of those kids who's like, I'm not going to talk to my parents about this, what's your advice to parents who feel like, why can't my child tell me this? What do you say to them?
Best thing you can do is be okay with that. That is not a failure as a parent if for whatever reason your child doesn't want to tell you something. And I speak on experience to that, right? When I was in high school, I had dealt with a classmate who was stalking me. So I didn't tell my parents about it. And that was a really unhealthy relationship that I had with just a classmate. It wasn't a romantic partnership or anything, but I still had this fear of my parents are going to be disappointed in me, or I'm going to get in trouble for some reason, or this behavior is going to continue and get worse. It's my fault, right? There was a lot of guilt and shame that I didn't bring to my parents, not because they're not good parents, right? I know that they support me. They're the best parents that I could possibly ask for, and they still just weren't the right people for me to go to, right? I instead was more comfortable going to my guidance counselor, going to my friend, going to my health teacher instead, because it just wasn't something that I wanted to talk to my parents about, and that's fine, right?
But eventually you did.
Exactly.
With
Well,
the
eventually
support.
they found out because it had kind of come
Yeah.
to a head, and the
Right.
school was like, okay, we need to rope them in on this because this is a bigger situation than a 16-year-old can handle.
Right.
Right? So at that point, they were like, well, Emma, why didn't you tell me about this? Why would you not tell us? And I'm kind of like, I don't know, right? Kids can't identify why it is that they don't want to tell somebody something. They can't always pinpoint a certain situation where they felt like they couldn't trust somebody, right?
Right.
It's more just the relationship that you have. So the best thing as a parent that you can do is be okay with that, right? And just acknowledge, maybe I'm not the right person for them to go to. Now what do I do, right? Can I still give them resources? Okay, if you don't want to talk to me, if this is happening, here's the text chat, web chat option for YWCA, right? Or that you can talk to your guidance counselor about this. You can talk to your health teacher about this, right? And just kind of planting the seed that if you talk to somebody, you're not going to get in trouble for whatever it is that's going on, right? It's not your fault, whatever is happening. I just want to make sure that you're safe, right? That's all that we want for our kids at the end of the day, is for them to be safe and supported.
Right.
So
I want to push on a kind of a hot topic,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. So right now, one of the hot topics is, if the school knows something, they need to tell the parents right away. So, and I think as a general rule, we as a school district, we don't want to keep any secrets from parents.
Yep.
We want parents to know it all, and we'd rather not have to carry that burden.
Right.
But so let's use your case for a minute. At what juncture did you kind of feel ready to disclose that to your mom and dad, even though you had been telling your counselor? Because I'm sure the counselor is dealing with wanting to support you, but knowing you would need support from mom and dad too. Like, how did that work for you?
So my situation was a little weird, and I felt very much like the decision was completely out of my hands. I didn't want my parents to know, but for my safety, my parents had to know.
Right.
So the school ended up calling them. And now as an adult, I'm like, okay, I'm glad that they did that.
Right. Yeah.
But as a teenager, I was like, why? Why would you get my parents involved in this, right? Because then it opens up a whole other storm of issues for me, right?
Right.
So it's hard to explain that to especially a teenager or a child that, okay, maybe your parents do need to know about this, right? For your safety, okay? It's kind of a weird circumstance, and it's very much case by case. Now, I do want to touch on our confidentiality. Like, obviously, my situation is a big part of why I got involved in this work. I'm very, very passionate about it, and I feel that if I were to have a resource like YWCA, my situation probably wouldn't have come to a head as it did, right? I probably would have had access to better supports and resources and wouldn't have continued a really harmful situation for me to be in. So I do want to note our confidentiality, because we are also the same. We don't want to hide anything from parents. However, we know a lot of students, a lot of teenagers especially, just don't want to get their parents involved for a number of reasons, right? So we at YWCA are covered under a state statute, RSA 173C. It really just means that anybody has the right to confidential communication with a domestic violence advocate, YWCA. So that means that if somebody, especially under the age of 18, contacts us and says, hey, I'm in an abusive relationship, or I was sexually assaulted, I don't know what to do, that conversation, legally, we are bound. It stays between us. The only time that we have to get somebody else involved, like DCYF, would be if a child is disclosing abuse in the home. So if the abuse is coming from an adult in the home, a sibling, a parent, something like that, that's when we have to get somebody else involved, right? But we have a really special trust automatically with some students, because they know they're not gonna get in trouble. We're not gonna call your parents, we can't. We're not gonna call your teachers, we can't, right? But we're able to have that conversation of, why don't you get your parents involved in this? Like, are your parents a good support for you? Who do you have at home that can kind of help you out with this, right? We kind of have a different level of trust with a lot of students, and we're able to allow the student to make that choice on their own, right? Because especially as a teenager, there's a lot of people making other decisions for you all the time, and you feel like you don't have any control in the situation. So we try to empower the student, empower the client to make that choice on their own, to make that phone call to mom, or
like guide
sit
them
down
in that
with
direction.
dad. Exactly, guide that in that direction, so that they still have a choice in the matter, that they are choosing to get their parents involved, and it's on their own terms, right? So we have a really special way of kind of empowering people to make their own decisions and allow them to choose what direction they want to go in, right? If it's an abusive relationship, do you want a protective order? Do you want to pursue a Title IX case? Whatever it may be, we will help you with whatever you choose, but let's identify your other supports together.
So a couple things that I want to say. The first is, so just so families in the community know, so we are mandated reporters. And I think that's one of the reasons why these things are underreported, because I think our students know, I think they're savvy, and they know if I tell my guidance counselor that I have been raped, they are required to report that to DCYF, no questions asked, it is what it is. And so I think, and like you said, there's shame, there's embarrassment, and then sometimes families, I have heard from families personally, they're also embarrassed and they don't know what to do about it. And then parents, and I don't think this, but I know parents sometimes feel like, what did I do wrong? I taught my child everything that they needed to know, and this still happened to them, and they feel horrible, right? So how do we encourage parents in a situation like that? Because as students get older, they start to make their own decisions.
Correct.
And not that it's their fault, but you can't, when you have an elementary school kid, you're just hovering and you're watching, and you can protect them. But as they get older and they go out and they do things, it's harder, and that's why we worry. Right?
Absolutely. And if you have that gut worried feeling, you're doing the right thing. You're already on the right track, right? thinking about your child, worrying about them. What are they doing? I want to make sure that they're safe, right? And I want to note too, our crisis line is open to parents as well. It's not just for survivors of domestic sexual violence, stalking, trafficking. It's also the support people, right? Because that's also a difficult situation to be in as a parent or as a friend of somebody who's experiencing something like this. How do I support them, right? And the best thing you can do is to just be there for them. Just listen, right? And it's okay if they don't come to you to talk about it, but planting the seed of, I'm here if you need me, I'm here if you want to talk about it. It's okay if you don't want to talk to me about it. Who else might you be able to talk to? YWCA, school counselor, outside therapist, who might it be?
Sort of a trusted adult
Yep.
in your life. So if I'm a parent listening to this and I suspect that my child is in an unhealthy relationship, or I suspect that things are happening that ought not be happening, you're saying that I could call the YWCA confidentially and have a conversation with somebody there about what do I do?
Yep.
Because kids don't have manuals.
Right.
And you find yourself like not exactly knowing which direction to go. And the other thing too is, and I know we touched on this before, I think as you and I have talked about this, not just here, but in other settings, the key is open communication, and I want to say this, and tell me if I'm wrong, and no judgment.
Yes. Yep.
Open communication and no judgment. And I say that as a pretty conservative guy who's, my wife and I had kind of strict rules at the house,
Yep.
and you know, our kids grow up to be their own people.
Right.
And they don't always live by the same exact
Yes.
rules that we think that they ought to, but they know we love them. We're open to hear whatever they have to say, even if we don't want to hear it. And so I think the communication and the no judgment
Yeah.
will at least allow them to know that they can say what they need to say.
Yep, absolutely. And sometimes, and again, speaking from experience, something that can sound really judgmental is, why didn't you tell me? Right? That's often the first thing that especially parents will say to their child is, why didn't you tell me? Right? That immediately kind of shifts onto the parents feeling upset about this rather than taking the situation for what it is. Other things that you could say to your child would be, thank you for sharing this with me. Right? I'm so glad that you trusted me with this information. I'm so proud of you for coming to me with this, right? And keeping that on the student or on the child rather than parent feels this way about it now and I'm so upset about this, I can't believe you didn't tell me, right? Non-judgment would be, I'm here to listen to you if you have any more to say.
And it's
right?
hard because as parents, we feel guilty because we feel like our job is to protect our kids.
Right.
And if we don't know about it, we can't protect them.
Yes.
So why didn't you tell us?
Why didn't you tell me?
Right. But the message that's being received is, you know, it just adds to the shame and it adds to the guilt. Instead of saying, I'm so glad that you came forward to tell me this. That's a really brave thing that you did. Because you're carrying this heavy burden.
That took courage for you to tell me about this. And I'm proud of you for coming to me with this, right? What else do you need from me? How can I best support you through this, right? Rather than kind of twisting it onto the parent without us even realizing, right? Because that's the first thought is, why wouldn't you come to me with this, right? But if as a parent you're having those questions, I would encourage you to hold off, keep the focus on the situation at hand, and then again, have that other conversation of why didn't they tell me at a later time, and maybe with somebody else, like your partner, like your trusted support person, maybe YWCA, why didn't my child tell me this, right? So that we can have that conversation without placing judgment and additional blame and shame on the survivor, on the student, on the child.
Right. So basically, to conclude, there is a sexual dating violence problem among our youth. And Bedford is not immune, and there are areas in Bedford, particularly when you tie in alcohol, where it's worse. And so this is not a blame game. This is something where as a community, we need to come together, recognize it, acknowledge it, accept it, and then take steps to address it. And those steps are really at home, at school, at church, at, you know, and it starts with communicating, making safe decisions, being open-minded, not judging, and then knowing what the resources are. And so maybe at the bottom of our screen, BCTV will add your number and some resources for for parents to call because this is really important. I'm so grateful that you are doing this work. I'm so grateful that you took the time to chat with me about this. I hope that this is helpful to families and communities. Teachers are going to be listening to this.
Yep.
And, you know, for our teachers, they're on the front lines and they, you know, they kind of hear stuff in the hallways and in their classrooms and, you know, they don't always act unless they need to, right? But it puts them in a tough spot sometimes too, and they're not always sure what to do.
Right. What do you do in that situation, right? And I say it all the time. Teachers are wearing so many different hats.
Yes.
They are playing teacher, social worker, all of the roles in the classroom and outside in the lunchroom, in the hallways, right?
Right.
And these topics, domestic and sexual violence, should make you uncomfortable, right? It should be kind of a gross gut feeling of like, I don't want this to happen to my students, right? So if you have that gut feeling already, again, you're on the right track. But I will say that talking about these, having these conversations about consent, boundaries, sexual violence, domestic violence, it is a muscle that you need to work, right? And with time, you will get more confident to identify the signs, identify what's happening, and be able to speak out against it and say, that's not okay what you're doing.
We need to wrap up soon, but a friend of mine sort of pushed the issue with me in a really healthy way to basically say, call it what it is.
Yep.
Sexual intercourse against your will is rape.
Yeah.
And it was hard for me to say that. It was hard for me to admit it. It was not because I didn't think it was happening, but once you say it, it becomes real.
Yep.
And for me to walk through Bedford High School and see these kids and you just want to protect them all and make sure they're all safe and happy and healthy, and to know that 101 of these kids have said, I have been raped. It like brings you to this level of crisis in your mind. So I'm so grateful that you're here.
Yeah.
I think we're going to continue to do our work together. And so any parting words of wisdom, or we?
That's about it. If we don't have our crisis line up, it's 603-668-2299. And again, that's open to students, family members, parents, teachers, administrators. That's open to anybody who wants a little bit more information about this stuff. If we can help in any way, shape, or form, that's exactly what we're here for. And I thank you for inviting me in and continuing to do this work.
And again, these reports are on our website, www.sau25.net, under information and reports. Thank you, Bedford.
Thank you.